Well, thank you all for coming tonight. Some of you are probably like me, old enough to remember the old Saturday Night Live skit where every week on Weekend Update, Chevy Chase reports that General Francisco Franco is still dead. Okay, well, I see some familiar faces here, and for those of you who have been here for all 5 lectures, I am still Robert Wright. I am still visiting professor of science and religion at Union Theological Seminary, and I'm still talking about a worldview that I think qualifies as spiritual, but is totally compatible with science and indeed is grounded in science. I want to thank, as I did on the first night, I want to thank, first of all, the John Templeton Foundation for supporting this whole endeavor, my time here at Union. And I want to thank the people at Union for making me feel so at home here and for indulging me in this exploration. The title of the talk tonight is God and Salvation in a Scientific Age, and as if that weren't ambitious enough, I'm actually going to try to accomplish a little more than that. I've also been promising to give a kind of a grand summing up of my worldview tonight, so I'll do that as well. I guess the good news for me is that there is some natural overlap between talking about God and salvation and doing this grand summing up. One danger of putting words like God and salvation in a title is that you may unduly raise expectations. So I want to be clear that my spiritual worldview cannot promise you eternal life in heaven or anywhere else, cannot offer you confident belief in a God in any traditional sense of that term. On the other hand, there have been non-traditional conceptions of God. Paul Tillich, who was here at Union, is famous for having defined God as the ground of being. And for that matter, there are conceptions of salvation that are different from the kind of eternal life in heaven that you find in Islam and Christianity, and that are most familiar to those of us who were raised in Abrahamic cultures. And in any event, I'm not just interested in the question of whether there are conceptions of God and salvation that fit into a scientifically grounded spiritual worldview. I'm also interested in the question of whether such a worldview can provide the kind of psychological benefits that these concepts have traditionally provided. So, consolation, hope, inspiration, moral guidance, moral strength, and so on. Before we get to all this, I want to do a quick review of some themes that I've covered in these 4 lectures. And I know some of you have been here for some of them for all of them, some of you for none of them. So I'm going to try to cover these themes, pithily enough and crisply enough so that the people who have heard them before don't fall asleep, but spend enough time on them so that they will not seem entirely unintelligible to people who are encountering them for the first time. Okay, so I started the first lecture by showing you this lavishly produced PowerPoint slide. That doesn't strike you as lavishly produced? Okay. There we go. The new agnosticism, okay? And the reason I did this, looks like I commissioned Roz Chast to do it, but actually I did it myself. The reason I did this is to emphasize that this thing I was talking about called the new agnosticism is not the same as my spiritual worldview, which is MSWV, but I think of my worldview as within this larger space I'm calling the new agnosticism. For that matter, there can be other spiritual worldviews in the space, and there might be worldviews that aren't spiritual. Some of them might overlap with mine, and so on. By the term new agnosticism, one thing I meant to do is distinguish it from the old agnosticism, the original agnosticism of the 19th century, and I think an important distinction is that actually, ironically, the new agnosticism has even more intellectual humility than the original agnosticism, because oddly enough, science since then has actually shown the world to be in many ways weirder and more inscrutable than 19th century scientists had reason to expect. And in addition to contrasting the worldview with the old agnosticism, I contrasted it with the worldview of the so-called new atheists, because they are not known for their intellectual humility. And to put a finer point on it, some of them are known for ridiculing the religious beliefs of people. And my own view, and a view I like to ascribe to the new agnosticism, is that we should judge people not on their beliefs, but on their behavior. Deed above creed, as the old saying goes. Now, in the first lecture, I said that my spiritual worldview does not have a name, and I invited anyone who stuck around to suggest names. So if any of you have an idea, we're going to have a reception afterwards. Feel free to propose it to me. My first name is Bob, so we could go with Bobism. I think, if you let it sink in, you'll see there's a certain grandeur to it. But maybe, if you can do better than that, do feel free. I have to confess that preparing these last few lectures have come in kind of rapid succession, particularly these last two in 3 days. I've gotten a little behind on my sleep, and sometimes when you lack sleep, you suffer lapses of judgment. And there actually was a time last night about 1 a.m. where I actually thought it would be a good idea to write a book and call it Bobism. I actually thought that, but that would not be a good idea, right? No, okay. Timely intervention on your part. Thank you. Another thing to review, spiritual worldviews tend to have cosmic narratives, stories about the world that relate a grand story of history to the human condition. I have one. Of course, mine has to be certainly true if it's going to be grounded in science. So strands of self-replicating material encase themselves in cells. You get societies of cells. They fuse into multicellular organisms. You get societies of multicellular organisms. One of them gets really smart enough to invent technology. Technology launches a second kind of evolution called cultural evolution. That brings social complexity, multi-village polities called chiefdoms, ancient city-states, regional states. People venture forth and communicate with other civilizations, and yes, they have wars, but they also have commerce and so on, fruitful interaction. Eventually, everyone is drawn into a giant global brain called the internet, and that's it. Here we are. That's a slightly oversimplified version. For people who are here, that when I actually talked about my view of history, they know there's been a lot more carnage. But as for why the question mark is there, the answer is that I think we're approaching a threshold where we could, put together a cohesive global society, or things could spiral downward very badly, which I think is a very real possibility. And I think the outcome will depend on whether we make moral progress. In particular, I emphasize the importance of cultivating what I call moral imagination, and that is putting yourself in the shoes of other people, not just in the sense of feeling their pain, kind of emotional empathy, but in the sense of cognitive empathy, perspective taking, understanding how the world looks from their point of view. And one reason I think that's important is because that can really facilitate the fruitful solution of so-called non-zero-sum games, which can in principle have win-win lose outcomes or lose-lose outcomes. In other words, the fortunes of the players may be correlated. And I think the world today is characterized by a lot of non-zero-sum games. Our fortunes are correlated with those of people halfway around the world, economic fortunes and misfortunes spread around the world. Disease spreads, chaos and suffering abroad comes back to haunt us. There are common projects to be embarked on about the climate and so on. So there are a lot of non-zero-sum games, and I think if we were better at moral imagination, we'd do a better job of solving them. One impediment, and this is related to moral imagination, one impediment, I think, to making the moral progress we need to make is the psychology of tribalism. Now, you see this in the form of religious tribalism, national, ideological tribalism of the kind that's becoming a real problem here in America, ethnic tribalism, but it's all the same psychology. I mean, some people say, well, the problem with the world is religion, the problem is this, the problem is that. It's always the same psychology. And the good news is that science is actually illuminating this, shedding light on cognitive biases that together kind of constitute the psychology of tribalism. and in some cases actually impede the exercise of moral imagination. It's turning out that these are unfortunately designed-in features of the brain. I mean, designed by natural selection. But science, by illuminating them, can inform, our attempt to solve the problem and to make the moral progress that I think is necessary. And by the way, this ongoing scientific revelation about what an imperfect instrument the human mind is another reason that I think intellectual humility is, if anything, more warranted now than when the term agnosticism was coined in the 19th century. We're learning that we are designed by natural selection to think we're right even when we're not right, to deceive ourselves about how right we are, both in the sense of, kind of literal truth and in the sense of moral rightness. And I think all of this is a case for intellectual humility. I guess it's good news that we've kind of been here before, in the sense that as technological evolution has pushed the envelope of social organization toward globalization, humankind has repeatedly faced this situation where either they kind of advance morally in some sense. In other words, they expand their circle of moral inclusion and include more and more human beings in it and consider them human beings worthy of decent treatment. Either they do that, or they pay the price in terms of suffering and chaos and war and so on. And often we as a species, often humankind has failed to meet that challenge, but sometimes they have succeeded, and in fact, that's how we came to be on the brink of globalization. There has been net success, net expansion of the moral circle. Now, Tuesday, just 2 nights ago, I raised the question of whether there might be a purpose behind this whole thing, behind the story I just showed you in that animation. So, is it possible that the first strands of self-replicating material, which have ultimately unfolded into a giant global brain that enmeshes us all, is it possible that they were in some sense designed to do that? It was like a seed, an algorithm for that. Now, I want to emphasize the process of the unfolding is a totally materialistic process, so far as we know. We understand how it works, natural selection, nuts and bolts technological evolution, and so on. But that doesn't mean that the machine, even if it's just a machine, couldn't have been set in motion for a purpose. So I drew this analogy. The comparison is squirrel DNA was designed to create a squirrel. It was designed by natural selection. But it has it creates this thing that has a purpose. A squirrel has a purpose. The purpose of things designed by natural selection is to get genes into the next generation. Not a very exotic or noble purpose necessarily, but that's what it is. And I raise the question, is it possible that the first strands of self-replicating material, that where we are now is in some sense a purposive process, whether there's some goal, some purpose, whether there's a kind of an end in mind. Although, I would emphasize, even if you believe that there is purpose, and I tried to provide some evidence for that in the last lecture, that doesn't tell you what the designer is. Is it just a process, kind of like natural selection, except on a larger scale? Is it some kind of being that if it is an intelligent being, it's not necessarily one that would deserve the term God or have the connotations we traditionally associate with the divine. On the other hand, when you realize that the ongoing expansion of social organization has had a kind of moral dimension to it, that's at least, spiritually suggestive, theologically suggestive. So, a big question for me is, does this purpose thing matter? Does it matter to you whether there's a purpose behind the process? And I'm actually interested in your feedback, whether, in the question and answer session afterwards or in the reception. I'd like to know. After all, many spiritual traditions, this is like vital. This is the inspirational power comes from the idea that, yes, there's a purpose to this whole thing. There's a God behind it, and that inspires you to comply with God's will, to help the purpose unfold. And I guess my question is, suppose I just tell the story, the narrative, and just don't get into the purpose question. Does that have any inspirational value? I mean, if I just say, look, this has been more than 1 billion years in the making. Organic life has, arduously lifted itself up from one level of organization to another, subcellular, cellular, multicellular, social, giant global brain. And now we're on the verge of kind of sealing the deal and creating a harmonious global society and maybe ending war and so on. Let's don't blow it now. It requires moral progress. It requires a certain kind of perspective and wisdom. Let's do it. I'm wondering, is that, no mention of purpose? It's just the fact of the matter. I'm curious as to whether that has motivational power for people. I'm curious for 2 reasons. One is that some people just aren't interested in the purpose question. Last week, somebody came up to me afterwards and said, but I don't understand, why does it have to have a purpose? People do ask me that, and I said, it doesn't have to have a purpose. It just could have one, and I am personally interested in the question of whether it does. Then again, I was brought up Southern Baptist. Maybe, other people with other upbringings are not so obsessed with the question of whether there is, in some sense, a higher purpose. Another reason I'm interested in whether the purpose part is needed, in a sense, is I cannot offer a confident, completely confident assertion that there is purpose, much less an assertion about what is behind the purpose. I mean, that's why I'm in the agnostic space, as it were. I'm not sure. I think there's evidence of purpose. If I had to guess, I'd say there is, but I can't say for sure. So, for me, I guess the final question about what is or isn't of inspirational value is a probabilistic conception of purpose of any value. That's what I have. I think there may well be a purpose. It seems as if it would have some of the hallmarks of divine purpose, but I don't know for sure. Does that kind of, less than certain belief in purpose do anything for you? I actually think it does for me, and this may just be a legacy of my religious upbringing, but I think it probably makes me work harder to overcome the psychology of tribalism, which is a daily uphill struggle for all of us, I think. Especially people who care about political causes and so on and get invested in them. And I think thinking that, okay, maybe there's this purpose and I can help it unfold, I think that helps for me, but your mileage may vary, and I would be interested in hearing what you have to say about that. So, whether or not there is purpose or any other kind of source of inspiration in the story, it's also the case that it's just in our interest to sustain moral progress as it happens, right? Because we are in this web of interdependence with people around the world. We are in the same boat. Our fortunes are increasingly intertwined. So if we can't work things out with them, that could be bad news for us. So there is just the case of sheer self-interest. And, again, we've been here before, and sometimes we have succeeded. People have made the necessary kind of moral adjustments to help the social organization advance. And in particular, religions have actually shown that they are capable of doing this. So, for example, if you look at the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians call the Old Testament, sometimes the Israelites are saying, the Moabites, the Assyrians, they're horrible people, their gods, should be crushed, and so on. Sometimes they're exhibiting a much more tolerant, even benevolent attitude toward them. And if you ask why, I think, dating scriptures is an uncertain process, but it seems to be the case that the more belligerent scriptures tend to be before the exile, and the more tolerant scriptures come from after the exile, because after the exile, all of these countries were no longer in a zero-sum relationship with Israel. They were no longer enemies. Now they were all in the Persian Empire. They were all in the same empire. They could do business with these people. And the belief that you can do business with people, play non-zero-sum games with people, seems to bring out the tolerant side of people, and seems to get them to emphasize the tolerant part of their scripture. And I think, in a way, the Quran, in several ways, particularly exhibits a kind of a keen sensitivity to non-zero sum opportunities. And that's even true of a verse that I'm going to show you, which is generally taken to be one of the most famously belligerent verses in the Quran. It's called the sword verse. It is cited by jihadists and also cited by people who have a dim view of Islam and want to show you that it's a religion of war. But it turns out the verse is more complicated than it at first seems. Okay. This is the heart of the sword verse. And when the sacred months are past, kill those who join other gods with God. That means polytheists. This is sometimes quoted as saying kill the infidels. That's not what it says. So for starters, Christians and Jews have nothing to fear here. It's the polytheists. Kill those who join other gods with God. Wherever you shall find them, and seize them, besiege them, and lay wait for them with every kind of ambush. Okay, that's not very nice. It's not a very nice part of the verse. It's probably not as bad as the part of Deuteronomy where God says to, if there's a nearby city that worships the wrong gods, you should kill everyone in it. But on the other hand, I would say, in all honesty, this verse has loomed larger in subsequent interpretations of Islam than the calls for genocide in the Bible have loomed in the subsequent interpretation of the Abrahamic or of Judaism and Christianity. Okay, but here is the next verse. If any one of those who join gods with God ask an asylum of thee, grant him an asylum that he may hear the word of God, and then let him reach his place of safety. This, for they are a people devoid of knowledge. Okay, that's sounding a little better, a little more tolerant. But what's interesting is the kind of preface to this in the verse before that sets the whole context for the interpretation of the verse. So look at the first verse. But this concerneth not those polytheists with whom ye are in league, and who shall have afterwards in no way failed you, nor aided anyone against you. So this whole verse does not apply to the polytheists who are your allies. It just applies to the polytheists who are your enemies. And then the final verse drives that home. How shall those who are polytheists, basically, be in league with God and with his apostle Muhammad? Well, so long as they are true to you, be true to them. So this is the sword verse, taken as the most jihadist verse in the Quran. And even here you see it's actually meant to apply only to enemies who have. It's really not about religion. It's about who is an enemy and who is an ally. And you see this kind of thing throughout the Quran. You also see it in the subsequent history of Islam, just as you have in the other religions. So originally the idea in Islam is the only people who can be allowed to keep their religion are the other so-called people of the book, Christians and Jews. Then the empire expands. Now there are Zoroastrians in the empire, and they decide that, well, the Zoroastrians, they're kind of people of the book. I mean, they have a book. It's not the same book, but this is no time to split hairs, so we're going to tolerate the Zoroastrians. As time goes on, there are times when in Asia, as the empire expands into Asia, Asian polytheists are, they're tolerated, allowed to keep their religion. Same with African polytheists. So all of these religions, now of course there is backsliding, and some is going on right now, but all of these religions have shown their capacity to adapt to the logic of non-zero sumness. When it is in the interest of the people in the religion, and is perceived to be in the interest of the people in the religion to do business, so to speak, with another group of people. When they aren't seen as a threat, you're much more likely to see tolerance. And in that sense, I would say there's been net, you might say, growth of God in a certain sense. God is conceived. The scope of God's compassion has tended to grow when it makes sense in these terms for it to grow. Okay, this brings us to the God question. God is in the title of this talk. I don't mean the is there a God question, actually. I've told you about all I can tell you about that. I mean, I think on balance, I would bet that there is a purpose unfolding. It has some of the hallmarks of the divine. I don't know for sure what's behind it. That's about it. But the question I want to discuss just briefly is whether, given this kind of state of uncertainty, if you have this view that I have, well, it's probably a purpose. It gets fuzzy after that. Is it intellectually defensible to use the word God? Okay. So, if you think of this kind of co-evolutionary process of having a purpose, you don't know if the designer is an intelligent being or a process or what, and it may not be conceivable by the human mind in any event. Could it make sense to give it the name God? To attribute properties to something, whose nature you don't clearly understand and may not be capable of understanding. Now, oddly, there's a question kind of like this, and I emphasize kind of like this, that is addressed sometimes in science. So, no one has ever seen an electron, so far as I know. All they have seen is the manifestations of the behavior of electron in experiments, in scientific experiments. And sometimes it does seem like a particle, the way you probably think of an electron. The manifestation, it seems like the kind of thing a particle would do. But other times, they say, no, actually, this seems like the kind of thing a wave would do. This is the famous wave-particle duality in quantum physics. Sometimes it makes sense to think of it as a particle, sometimes a wave. And it actually gets weirder than that. Because if you ask physicists, okay, so sometimes it's a wave. You mean it's like an ocean wave? And they say, well, actually, the way to think about the wave is just a kind of an abstract probability distribution telling you what the chances are that the electron will be in a given place when you measure it. And you say, okay, so it's telling us what the probability is that the electron is in these different places. And they say, no, no, no. Because until you measure it, it's not in any of those places. It's nowhere. It has no specific location. It's the act of measuring it that brings it. Okay, so it only gets weirder. You can keep asking them questions. It only gets weirder. So it's hard to conceive of an electron, right? But physicists use the term electron, and they attribute certain properties to it. I've actually heard two scientists argue about whether electrons exist. Really, is there a thing that corresponds to what we're calling an electron, a thing that's responsible for the properties we associate with the electron? They disagree, but they tend to agree that we might as well use the word just because it's useful. It makes scientific discourse more efficient. Acting as if electrons exist leads to technological progress, allows us to build computers, and so on. Now, you may guess where I'm going with this. So by a kind of analogy, and I stress just a kind of analogy, loose analogy, if someone says to me, I don't know what's behind this kind of directionality, this seemingly purposive directionality that has a moral dimension, but I think something is, and I'm going to think of it as a God, and I'm going to think of it as kind of being on our side, rooting for us, because there are these parts of the process that we can hang on to, and that can help us out if we seize them wisely. So I'm going to think of this God as being on our side, and I'm going to think of myself as on this God's team, and as even trying to please this God and kind of comply with the intentions I attribute to the God, and be a good person, and treat other people decently, and exercise my moral imagination and try not to contribute to the gratuitous conflict in the world. If somebody says that to me, I would say, whatever works, right? I'm not saying that God exists in the sense that electrons exist. There are various imprecisions in that analogy. But I am saying that, living a good life is hard. A good life both in the sense of a morally good life and a good life in the sense of, maintaining your well-being in the face of life's vicissitudes. That's all very difficult. And if what helps you live a good and morally defensible life is having an undoubtedly oversimplified conception of something you don't understand and something humans may not be even in principle of understanding or conceiving, I can imagine worse intellectual transgressions than that. And even if, you carry it to a finer and less plausible level of detail, if you think of God as the God in the Sistine Chapel, with literally white beard, and, smiling down on you, approving of the good things you did, gently forgiving you when you do bad things, again, I would just say whatever works. And by the way, there's actually a school of philosophy that called pragmatism, that I don't want to oversimplify it, partly because I'm not conversant enough in it to know whether I am oversimplifying it. But loosely speaking, there is this idea in pragmatism that if believing something brings good results, then you can think of it as true. William James wrote an essay called The Will to Believe, in which you see this kind of logic applied to the very question of belief in God. And the final thing I would just say about this is, you know, there are a lot of people who just flatly assert that the universe has no purpose. So Steven Weinberg, for example, the physicist, said, the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. Now, I actually, disagree, of course, but that's not my point. My point is, if someday we find out whether there is in any sense purpose, and it turns out there is purpose, okay, who would have been closer to the truth? Steven Weinberg, who says there's no purpose, or somebody who believes there is a purpose, has a grossly oversimplified and misleading conception of what the source of the purpose is? I would say, fundamentalists, it would be closer to the truth on the most fundamental question here. Is there purpose? So could turn out Steven Weinberg's wrong. We don't ridicule him for his belief, and so I don't ridicule other people for their beliefs. Okay, so enough about God. Now on to salvation. Sure, you were looking forward to this salvation part. So I grew up a Christian, and for Christians, salvation is an important part of the deal. I actually, at age 9, I felt the Spirit in me and went to the front of the church during the invitation. The invitation at the end of a Southern Baptist sermon is when the minister calls you to, they're usually playing this actually very nice song called Just As I Am. It's a very pretty song. And I don't know why this happened. I wasn't goaded. My parents weren't even there. This was actually a special service. It was during a summer revival where they bring in a special evangelist, like a visiting minister who's really good at this. His name was Homer Martinez, and he was really good at it. So anyway, I did this. I was saved for a certain amount of time. Then I encountered the theory of natural selection in high school, and as it happened, the people in my religious milieu were creationists. My parents grew up on farms in West Texas, so they were, pretty sure the world had been created in 6 days. So I lost my faith. But, it's a central concept, the concept of salvation, to Christians and to Muslims. Now, the word salvation occupies no such central place in Asian religions, for example, like Buddhism and Hinduism. They tend to use, for kind of the ultimate goal, they tend to use terms like liberation or enlightenment. But some scholars have made the case that this kind of Abrahamic salvation and Asian liberation or enlightenment have enough in common that it makes sense to treat them as, broadly speaking, the same phenomenon. And one person who's done this is Ninian Smart, the late Ninian Smart, scholar of religion. Here's what he said about salvation in the broad sense of the term. He said, the implication of the idea is that human beings are in some kind of unfortunate condition and may achieve an ultimately good state either by their own efforts or through the intervention of some divine power. And I think he's right. I think there's a certain amount of kind of East-West unity here. And in fleshing this out, I am going to choose as representative of the Abrahamic tradition, Christianity, because I'm much more familiar with that than Islam. And in the case of Asia, I'm going to talk a little about Buddhism because I know more about that than Hinduism. So, one question is what is the unfortunate condition, right? Well, to Christians, it's being in a state of sin, being born with sinful tendencies, and also having inherited the moral burden of Adam's original sin. For Buddhists, the unfortunate condition is, the word is dukkha, usually translated as suffering. So the unfortunate condition is that we live in a state of recurrent suffering. Now, these sound kind of different, the difference between sin and suffering. But on the other hand, in Buddhism, the idea is that the kind of behavioral reforms you make to start alleviating your suffering also make you a better person. So in a sense, you could say, loosely speaking, a less sinful person. So the war on suffering is, in a sense, a war on sin. And for that matter, in Christianity, there's the expectation that salvation involves a lessened tendency to sin, although that's not technically what it is. Technically, it's assured forgiveness by virtue of your belief in Christ. But there is the idea that you're being drawn out of this world of sin, that you're mired in, and that does involve suffering. And more than that, salvation, it's not just that you will be saved at the end of your life. There is the reassurance right now that you are saved. That is a real relief, too. So I would say both of these, in Christianity and Buddhism, we're talking about you become a more fulfilled person, less afflicted by suffering, a happier person, and also the idea is clearly in both that you bring your behavior in closer alignment with moral truth. There's also the fact that Buddhism locates in a way, the core of our suffering in, our thirst for things, desire, and needless to say, desire plays a role in the Christian account of sin. Now, an emphasis that's more distinctive to Buddhism is the idea that the source of suffering, what stands between you and salvation, is that we live in a world of delusion. We are afflicted by delusion and ignorance. That's more explicit in Buddhism. There are echoes of it in Christianity. It's Jesus, after all, who said that the truth will set you free, and that sounds like a crystalline distillation of the Buddhist idea that liberation comes through clear vision and dispelling delusion. But I think Jesus meant something a little different. That was much more a reference to sin and the burden of sin. And in any event, this idea of delusion and its role in our suffering and it as an impediment to salvation is much more fully worked out in Buddhist scripture than in Christian scripture. So, as I said, I was raised a Christian, but right now the path I'm on is much more of a Buddhist path. I meditate every day. I've been to, maybe half a dozen meditation retreats of like a week or more. And so, meditation is my one regular spiritual practice, and so it's the practical core of my spiritual worldview. Now, you might say, wait a second, I thought you were going to unveil a new spiritual worldview, and all you're saying is that you meditate like everyone else in America these days. Well, there is some truth to that. On the other hand, new things generally involve the kind of remixing of pre-existing elements. And one thing that I'm doing, that's not always done with meditation or Buddhist philosophy, is bringing in a strong dose of evolutionary psychology, which is a worldview I subscribe to. And if you ask, how does evolutionary psychology relate to Buddhist philosophy, I would say, I'm not sure you want to get me started on that. I just finished a book on it. If it'll be out in about a year. If you're curious, there's an online course I teach called Buddhism and Modern Psychology that conveys some of it. But I would say a couple of things in passing. The main thing is that evolutionary psychology corroborates the Buddhist idea that we are deluded, that the mind is not a reliable guide to truth. Now, the form this often comes in psychology is attention to specific kind of cognitive biases that I've discussed in the course of these lectures, some of which I've discussed. And in Buddhism, there's the idea of a much more subtle and pervasive delusion. It's like a veil of delusion in Buddhism. But I actually think that from the standpoint of evolutionary psychology, this kind of more dramatic conception of how misled we are by our minds is actually defensible. And I can elaborate in Q&A if you have questions about this. For now, I would just say that the fundamental point is that natural selection did not design the mind to see truth per se. The bottom line in the design of the mind and everything else natural selection designs is what will get the most genes into the next generation. If seeing things clearly will get genes into the next generation, then there will be clear vision, and sometimes there is. Like, if a large object is approaching, you want to see it, so you get out of the way. But even there, we actually don't see clearly. People overestimate the speed with which large objects are approaching. right? And so that's a case where natural selection actually distorts our vision slightly to be on the safe side, because it's better to get out of the way too soon than to get out of the way too late, okay? So even there's a little bias, but it goes well beyond that, and the general principle is that if delusion will get your genes into the next generation, then delusion will be built into the human brain, and it is built into the human brain. We're designed to, again, think we're right when we're not, be sure we're right when we're not. So, back to the salvation question. If you ask me, is Buddhist salvation possible? Is that a practical goal? Well, in the sense of being released from the cycle of rebirth, I would say that question is above my pay grade. I don't get into reincarnation. I've never been totally clear on why you would want to be released from the cycle of rebirth, actually. I mean, it wouldn't, I can imagine worse things than being reborn after you die. There are parts of life I'd want to skip, but not all of it. But as for whether you can attain salvation in the sense of liberation from suffering, well, I would say, don't ask me, ask people who have done so much meditation that they could plausibly aspire to such a thing. And as it happens, I have asked them. I've interviewed a number of people, really super serious meditators, tens of thousands of hours of meditation. And what I'd say is that people can come surprisingly close. I've talked to people that, and I believe their accounts, that they are in a place where, they say, I can't imagine anything being added to my life that would make it better. And that's the state that they live in. They are largely free from the things like anxiety and sadness that bedevil us. I don't mean they don't have the feelings, but the feelings don't have the grip on them. The closest I get to this is when I'm on retreat. At the end of a retreat, you can be in a pretty great zone, and I'm here to tell you it's great, and if I could live my whole life like that, I would. I haven't been able to find anybody who wants to give you a grant to spend the rest of your life at a meditation retreat, but if anybody knows of somebody, let me know. What's that? And you mean beg for food every day? But then, my Sangha? I don't have a Sangha yet. A Sangha is a community in Buddhism. The Babism Sangha. Okay. Could happen. I feel the momentum building. Okay, so the good news is this, in my experience. So being that close to salvation, liberation from suffering, it would take a bigger investment than most of us time to make. But, a daily meditation practice does move you, some distance toward the goal, okay? I think, you have more resilience, more equanimity. You endure hardship and loss better. Things like anxiety and sadness, it's not that you don't have the feelings, but you view them with, in a certain sense, more detachment, although this kind of language is controversial among Buddhists. But in a certain sense, they don't get the same purchase on you. And this is the kind of thing I had in mind when I said, one question I have is, can a scientifically grounded worldview, spiritual worldview, bring you some of the psychological benefits that have traditionally come from traditional versions of the conception of God or traditional notions of salvation? And I think the answer is they can, because I think there is a version of Buddhist meditation that's just totally naturalistic in conception, and scientifically grounded. Doesn't involve any unfounded supernatural claims or anything. Now, what's maybe more interesting to me is that it seems to be a natural part of this path that does lead to more happiness, that you also become a better person. It's not quite automatic, but it tends to happen. You tend to become less judgmental of other people, a more considerate person. And I would say it's easier to exercise, what I call moral imagination, that the barriers to that tend to be eroded through meditative practice. This is most dramatic at the end of a retreat. I mean, at the end of some retreats, I have felt like if you just replicated me and put that in the place of everyone on the planet, that would be the end of war. But then, after a few days back in the real world, I'm the old me, and I wouldn't recommend that. But even then, I think a daily meditation practice, it really does. It makes you a better person. And this is, another kind of fortunate convergence. I mean, the first fortunate convergence we talked about tonight was that, as I said, through history, the self-interest of people is aligned with kind of the expansion of the moral circle with moral progress. Okay, so it's good that self-interest is aligned with moral progress. Here's another kind of fortunate convergence, that the pursuit of happiness, a certain kind of well-being, does converge with becoming a better person. Okay, so the pursuit of peace of mind, of serenity, and so on, can bring you into closer alignment with the moral truth. You can imagine a universe in which that's not the case, in which the only way to become happier is to do it at the expense of other people. But that's not the universe we live in. Now, in Buddhism, one of the ultimate experiences of truth is the so-called not-self experiences. It is said to be an ultimate experience of truth. This consists of various things, including the idea that your thoughts and feelings really aren't a part of you in the sense in which you had thought of them as being, and also the idea that the bounds of yourself are not as firm as you had thought of them as being. And the idea is that this is really a true apprehension of reality. This is the way things are. It's just an accurate perception of the world. But also, again, there is a moral counterpart to this. The experience also inclines you more to identify with other human beings, to see their welfare as important as yours, because after all, the bounds between you and them the bounds have dissolved. And I actually think there's real truth here. I mean, I think, first of all, as an apprehension of the reality about the human mind and the human mind's relationship to reality, you can defend the not-self experience as being closer to the truth than our intuitive conception of ourself, which, like so many parts of our mind, I think was designed by natural selection to get us through life, to help us tell these impressive stories about ourselves as these really totally together people and so on, but is not necessarily an accurate reflection of the actual structure of the mind and what's actually going on inside you in terms of motivation and so on. So I think the not-self experience as just an apprehension of reality is defensible. And I would argue that the moral part is also defensible from a standpoint of evolutionary psychology, that a feeling of selflessness toward other people, of love toward other people, is a truer apprehension than the ordinary apprehension that we're the most important people in the world, which is the assumption that underlies almost everything we do, if you really pay attention to it, except for our families and so on. But now that's an argument that would happily time does not permit me to make, because it's not a trivially easy one to make, and it involves some moral assumptions and so on. I mean, the second part of the argument about moral truth. But I'm happy to talk about it further if people want to. But again, we see that kind of interesting things converge here. Now we have three things converging. Okay, we've already said that the pursuit of happiness can lead you to closer alignment with moral truth. That's nice. But now we're throwing in truth in the sense of just accurate apprehension of reality, accurate apprehension of the structure of your mind, its relationship to the world. And the claim is that truth in that sense, objective truth, is aligned with moral truth and with well-being. So it's like the trifecta. That's nice. You can, again, imagine universes in which this isn't the case, but apparently we live in one in which, or at least I claim we live in one in which it is. There's one other thing in this alignment, which is helping to save the world. Okay, I mean, remember, my argument is that the movement toward moral truth, involving as it does enhanced moral imagination and an erosion of tribal psychology, that can help save the world. So, if these three things, objective truth, moral truth, which are associated with the pursuit of happiness, if they help you become a better person, then you're also contributing to that larger goal. You could say that what we're seeing is that individual salvation is aligned with social salvation, okay? And actually, in the Hebrew Bible, that's the way the term salvation is usually used to refer to the social system. It's usually Israel that is being saved. And I think you can make the case that the pursuit of individual salvation, as we're talking about it, can be conducive to social salvation at the kind of global scale. Okay, so in closing, I would just say, if you're looking for a modern theology, a theology that makes sense in a scientific age, it turns out that there's actually a very ancient theology that I think does a pretty good job. It's associated with the word logos. This is a Greek word that is often translated as word. In fact, in the Gospel of John, where it says, "In the beginning was the Word," the word that's translated as word is logos. But word is kind of a misleading translation there because logos would have been associated with a whole philosophy that would have been prevalent in the Greek-speaking world at that time, and this is almost certainly a reference to logos in that sense of the term. And in that sense of the term, logos has a much broader meaning. It refers to reason, to a kind of a logic, and philosophically and theologically, it meant a kind of a logic that is playing itself out through history. It's a logic that animates history, moves history directionally in some accounts, and is a manifestation of a transcendent God. But the transcendent God is out there, hands off. And what's happening, the manifestation in here, is just a piece of logic, the manifestation in the material world. Now, I would say you could view what I talked about in an earlier lecture, the kind of interplay of zero-sum and non-zero-sum dynamics, and the natural expansion of the web of non-zero-sumness through history, as driven by technology. You could describe that as a playing out of a kind of logic. You could compare it to the logos. And for that matter, it goes back further. I mean, biological evolution, the growth of biological complexity, can be described in game theoretical terms as, again, kind of, you might say, the triumph of non-zero-sumness. So this is a dynamic you could describe throughout that history I showed you, from self-replicating material to global brain. And actually, in probably the most significant existing version of a logos theology we have, there are elements of this, of an emphasis on non-zero-sumness. This comes from Philo of Alexandria, sometimes called Philo Judaeus because he was Jewish. He lived in Egypt during the Roman Empire. In fact, he lived during the time of Jesus. And he, at one point, he's talking about the relationship of different peoples, different animals, different plant species, the whole ecosystem. And I want to show you what he says. God has made none of these particular things complete in itself, so that it should have no need at all of other things. Thus, through the desire to obtain what it needs, it must perforce approach that which can supply its needs, and this approach must be mutual and reciprocal. Thus, through reciprocity and combination, even as a lyre is formed of unlike notes, God meant that they should come to fellowship and concord and form a single harmony, and that a universal give and take should govern them and lead up to the consummation of the whole world. Well, I'm going to go on record as being in favor of that. The last part is the whole world may become, as it were, one city and enjoy the best of polities, a democracy. I say amen to that as well. Final point. I mentioned Paul Tillich, the famous theologian who was here at Union and defined God as the ground of being, or identified God with the ground of being. There was a conference here at Union yesterday to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Paul Tillich's death, and I dropped by, in between working on this lecture. I dropped by to take a break and listened in on the lecture by a very distinguished Tillich scholar who was here to deliver the talk. And the impression I got was that he himself, this scholar, had a a very minimalist theology. At best, an extremely vague conception of God, if perhaps any conception at all. But he said one thing that got my attention. He said, our job is to answer a calling whose message is obscure. And I thought that was an interesting way to think of it. It's just like, our job, there is a calling, Our job is to answer a calling. Could be the universe doing the calling, who knows? It's a calling. But there's one part I kind of disagreed with. He says our job is to answer a calling whose message is obscure. I don't think the message is actually all that obscure. I think we're being called to become better people, to become morally better people, and also to see the world in a literally clear way. I think we're being called to move toward moral truth and scientific truth, and toward enlightenment in the fullest sense of that term. I think the message is, in a certain sense, about a connection between individual salvation and social salvation. As for what is sending the message, what is doing the calling, I would say, call it whatever you want. So, thank you. So, as I said, there's food here. Let's do a few questions from the audience, but not too many, because I've been talking a while, and we can mill around and talk, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Philip, do you have the microphone? Do you want to take the pressure of selecting people off of me and just... By the way, I should thank Philip, too. I mean, all the logistics for all these talks have been Philip-sponsored, and he's been great. And if the food is bad, he would be the person to blame. Certainly not me.
Hello. Excellent lecture. Thank you. I have a question and perhaps even a challenge. You mentioned earlier that Buddhism defines the delusion, and by defining it, leads a clearer path to salvation. And then you quickly elided over the Christian tradition.
Right.
So the challenge is, if you go back to 1 Corinthians, St. Paul says that the way of the cross is foolishness to those of the world. So there's a sense of a delusional construct there. And of course, by way of the cross, he means God's self-emptying love. His kenosis is a path to true joy and salvation. And that's rich in our tradition, from Aquinas to Duns Scotus to Newman, and ultimately to Thomas Merton, who talks about the false self and the true self, much as you did here. So I wanted you to comment on the Christian tradition vis-a-vis this delusion.
Okay. A couple of things. Quickly, one thing I meant to say about Christianity about its own adaptation to non-zero-sum dynamics is, I think it's no coincidence that the explicit emphasis of St. Paul on inter-ethnic inclusion, neither Jew nor Greek, all are one in Jesus Christ. I think it's no coincidence that he's in the Roman Empire. It's a cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic empire. He's building a church in the Roman Empire. He wants it to be a big church. He wants there to be non-zero-sum dynamics between him and the congregants, among the congregants, and I think that's another kind of adaptation to non-zero-sumness. It's also a way of stalling, because I don't know. I should have confessed, in case it's not evident. I'm not a theologian. I don't know that much about theology. Now, let me say one thing, and then get back to you for clarification. There are mystical traditions in Christianity and others, and in particular, there is a sense of unity with God through contemplative practice, of kind of, in a sense, contact with God, becoming one with God. In a certain sense, there is that in Hinduism as well, the sense that the self and Brahman, the kind of universal soul, are the same thing. And I would suggest that psychologically what's going on there is very much what's going on in the part of the not-self experience where there's a sense of the dissolution of the bounds of the self. And I've gotten a little bit of that myself on a particularly fortuitous meditation retreat. And I think, science may someday tell us, but I think the apprehension is the same, possibly, and put in different terms. In fact, there's a big squabble between Buddhists and Hindus as to whether, wait a second, is it that the self is merging with everything, or as Buddhists would have it, the self doesn't exist, so it couldn't be merging. Well, I think actually they're the same experience, and that's terminological squabble. Now, you referred to God empty. You're saying that you said two things. That the conception of the self, you think, is related to the Buddhist not-self experience, but also that God's outpouring of love is fundamental, right?
Right. So Aquinas talks about the pursuit of power, pleasure, honor, wealth as being in many ways the path to concupiscence, towards this delusional construct. The way to live is the way to beatitudo, to joy, is the other way around, to empty yourself and not to accumulate.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the three poisons in Buddhism, they're generally translated as greed, hatred, and delusion. I believe you see these three terms in Hinduism too, and I think maybe the idea is that it's the greed and the hatred lead to the delusion, which I don't think is explicit in Buddhism, but that actually kind of makes sense to me. But I would say, and maybe this will distance Buddhism from Christianity in a sense, I mean, you tell me, but the word that is translated as greed in that refrain, which is repeated at meditation retreats and so on, is probably more accurately translated more broadly. In other words, it's not just greed in the sense of wanting to acquire material things. It's like a thirst. It's like a hunger for gratification, for anything. It's just kind of untrammeled desire, a seeking of attachment. So it's greed in a much broader sense that is related to delusion. And similarly, the hatred is probably better translated as aversion. So yes, being averse to people and hating them is not encouraged, but being averse to things generally is not. In fact, there's a real element of stoicism in Buddhism. Just surviving any situation, overcoming aversion, and so on. But now you tell, does that any of that relate?
I think there's a commonality there, though. A sense of attachment is precisely the mark of sin.
Yeah.
The mark of...
Yeah. And again, in Buddhism, attachment is a no-no. It's meant very broadly, though, including attachment to your feelings, attachment to your thoughts. That's what gets you into trouble. Attachment to yourself. Attachment to the esteem in which you're held. These are the things that get us in trouble is, in a way what they're saying is, all these impulses that were designed in you and these kinds of thoughts that were designed into the human brain by natural selection, which just wanted to get genes in the next generation, distance yourself from it. Let go of them. You don't have to be attached to them. And that's the part of the not-self experience that isn't about a dissolution of the bounds around you. It's about almost a disaggregation of what's inside of you and letting go of these feelings that intuition tells you are a fundamental part of you. But, you can have a meditative experience of just seeing the letting go happen. I mean, occasionally, I have, it doesn't happen reliably, sadly, but had deep anxiety, meditated, and you still see the knot of anxiety. But suddenly, you're just observing it as if it were a piece of abstract sculpture in a museum. I mean, really, total indifference to it. The feeling is still there. It's just lost its grip on you. And I should say that evolutionary psychology helps me here, kind of thinking about what these feelings were designed for. When you think about what specific feelings were designed for, and that they were designed by this thing whose agenda was to get the most genes in the next generation, I mean, give me a break. That we can do better than that. Thinking about the absurdity of some of these feelings helps.
So one quick question on the physics analogy.
You're an actual physicist, right?
Yeah, I was
afraid of this. Go ahead. I said about electrons may be wrong, but go ahead.
No, it was actually sort of right, and laudably you did say that it was an imprecise metaphor analogy.
Right.
But the one thing that still struck me was you made use of the notion that our conception of an electron may be weird or vague, or somehow even two physicists will argue about what it even means. And then you use that as a lever to say, well, maybe that kind of imprecision or vagueness should be invoked with the conception of a God. And therefore you get to your whatever place, whatever works. And I guess the issue that raises for me is that it's merely English language or human language that has a difficult time with articulating what an electron is, but if we shift over to a different language, mathematics, we understand the electron with uncanny precision, right? We use the mathematics to make predictions of an electron that agree with the experiment to 10 decimal places down the line.
Right.
And it's that unbelievable precision
Right.
that seems to be lacking on the other side of the equation that you were drawing, and therefore suggests that the analogy may sort of really have no power at all.
Yeah, you know, as I said, it's an imprecise analogy. The other thing is you're like in different realms. You know, with science, you know, when we talk about something having good effects, positive effects, and being validated by virtue of the effects that the belief has, we're talking about the successful manipulation of the material world, right? You build computers based on this conception of an electron, and I understand that ultimately what pays off there is the mathematics, right, in the building of a computer, and that's all true. Whereas I was talking about, you know, a moral realm, and the effects being good in a moral sense, helping you lead a good life, and you know, I would say there, I guess I'm suggesting that leading a good life morally is sufficiently hard and sufficiently important that people do it, that as a practical matter, it would make sense for us all to consider kind of the best litmus test for someone's theological beliefs, just what kind of person it makes them, you know? So it's an extremely loose analogy. And I try to emphasize, I mean, I play it out a little more at the end of my book, The Evolution of God, but I don't think I say anything that would particularly satisfy you. I just basically do more disclaimers that might satisfy you. I have a question for you, actually. You're an advocate of string theory, right? Yeah, so my question is, if string theory turns out to be true, will that mean that this notion of the electron, you know, kind of dissolves in a sense? Because actually, at a more fundamental level, it's like strings vibrating, and like, you know, so here's the strings at a super fundamental level, here's the properties of the electron, and this thing we thought of as the electron, it's just no longer useful to think about that, right? It would be not useful to think about the electron per se anymore?
Well, I would frame it a little bit differently. I think what we've learned from science is that your language and explanation needs to be catered to the scale at which you're examining the universe. And if you're examining the universe at the scale of baseballs, then talking about it using Newtonian language is the most powerful language that we have. If you go to a Yankees game and try to describe the motion of that baseball using quantum mechanics, can you do it? In principle, yes. But to describe the motion of 10 to the 23 particles using the Schrodinger equation would give you such a bizarre description that you'd never actually know that it was a baseball flying from home plate to center field. So similarly, if you go down to the atomic scale, then using the quantum notion of electron will probably always be a useful way of describing what's going on. If you go even smaller, scales that are many orders of magnitude smaller than the scale of an atom, then it may well be that a different language comes into play. It may be the language of string theory, it may not. We don't know yet. But that's really the deep lesson of science, and it's a very important one, because imagine if it were the case that to understand anything about the universe, you needed to understand it at its deepest level. If that were the case, science would never have gotten off the ground. It is so powerful that you can understand nature scale by scale by scale. And at every scale, it's not as though the deeper one eliminates the language and ideas that you were previously using at the larger scale. Right. It simply allows you to describe things at a yet more fundamental level.
Right. So at each level, you're using the most efficient language.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Thank you. I've been reflecting in the last couple of months something that I think really speaks to this conversation that you're having. The ability to describe something to a very precise level is not the same as knowing what it is or why it is.
Do you have a specific example? Is it something I've discussed?
Yes, no.
Oh.
The example I was thinking of is gravity. I think this may have something to do with your first talk when you were talking about particles in one area affecting Okay, so gravity is like that, right?
I don't know. but
Yes, well,
I'll take your word for it.
There are bodies at a distance that are having, that have a relationship. And in these weeks since you were discussing that, I realized that, God damn, it's impossibly incredible that it's the square that describes that. And two, the fact that it describes it does not tell you what it is.
I think there are philosophers who would agree. That's what I could say. I'm a little out of my depth. Well, to describe is not necessarily to explain. Sometimes it's sufficient for your purposes of manipulating the world. But yeah, I mean, there's still, it's like we talk about scientific law, but nobody's ever explained to me what enforces the law. Right? I mean, it's like there are these regularities, but it's like in a computer algorithm, what's doing it physically, whereas it's like, why does every inch of space comply with this law? That's a question. If anybody has the answer to that, I think we should put the microphone immediately in their hands, Philip. But if not, maybe you can, and maybe what we should do, I should maybe write down, just ask questions quickly. There are quite a few hands up, maybe 4 or 5 in a row. I won't answer them individually. I'll write them down and try to do my best. So why don't you do 4 people?
So it seems like what your worldview is saying is that religion is good insofar as it brings about good results, so in a way the ends justify the means. And I think the obvious follow-up to that is, what about when the results are controversial and people disagree about whether those results are good or bad? How you account for that?
And my question is about the purpose that you perceive from our history. If the human mind is inherently problematic and the global mind that is formed by the human mind is therefore also problematic, how then do you distinguish purpose as objectively exists embedded in the flow of history from the purpose that is perceived by this problematic global mind?
Wait, can you say that last part? So if the human mind is what constitutes the global mind, or human minds constitute the global mind, right?
Yes.
And then what's the part about purpose?
Then the problematic human mind would also mean that a global mind would also be problematic and imperfect. How then do you distinguish purpose as objectively embedded into the flow of history from purpose as our problematic mind perceives it? Does that make sense?
I'm not sure, but I'll come back to you if...
Okay, what if this purpose exists not because it really does, but because the global mind think it is good that it does, and then they tell us, okay, there is a purpose.
The global mind tries to deceive us into thinking there's a purpose?
Yes. You have to acknowledge there is a possibility for that in your worldview, right?
I guess I can imagine it. You mean this would be in the future when the global mind assumes like an artificial intelligence level of... This is like not something that's happening now, but it could happen?
Well, I don't know. I don't know about artificial intelligence, but
Okay.
we can talk more about this afterwards.
What's the role of information in the universe in your worldview? Does your worldview assume that the amount of information in the universe is going to continue? Would you characterize information as being inherently good and lack of information or disorder as being inherently bad? So yeah, well, how does the amount of information in the universe play a role in your worldview?
I wanted to mention, I think Wrightism is probably a little bit more marketable than Bobism.
Wrightism than Bobism?
Yeah. Although you have the obvious objection.
Do we have any declared professed rightists here at this moment? Would you like to be the first?
Why not?
Okay.
Well, I'll give you
signed
the
up.
reason why not. I would say, how would you answer probably the obvious criticism, well, one that you'll probably get often, which is, I think that just speaking from an ecological and a geological perspective, it seems that there's a relative wealth of evidence that perhaps there is some type of singular purpose in some sort of teleological way. I suppose the problem for me is maybe extinction events. Is I would wonder, why would there be so many if there was some type of evolutionary process from the first genetic material for from the Big Bang to our ultimate end. But I kind of wonder from the perspective of kind of thinking about ultimate purpose and thinking about moral truth and the extent to which it would have to rely on some type of entity is, to what extent do you think there's a possibility that you may just want there to be a moral truth? And as a result,
what? I'm sorry?
that you may want there to be a moral truth. And that as a result, you may be kind of creating intellectual justification for that moral truth.
Okay.
Other than that, I'll definitely sign up to be the first writer.
Okay. Regardless of whether I satisfactorily answer your question. Okay. Unless you have a strong desire to give it to one more person, I guess we'll go with that. Okay. All right, one more quick one.
How is your worldview that much different from pantheism or deism? Because it seems to me that it's either one of those two, or is it none? And also, when it comes to the laws of physics, my view would be that the best way to look at them as descriptions of physical regularity, and not think of them as things that exist separate from the spatio-temporal world. They're just kind of like descriptions we have of sports or things like that. They're not things that, there's no lawgiver in the sense of, the laws don't exist and then something makes it happen. The laws are just descriptions of physical regularity. In other words, they're descriptive rather than prescriptive.
Oh yeah, they're certainly not prescriptive. I mean, what I meant is just that, everywhere else we use the word law, like in human society, we think there's an enforcer, right? It doesn't happen automatically, and so we use this word with science, and I think it's not a question you could casually dismiss. It's like, what keeps things I take your point. We should think of science as a description of regularity, and that suffices for practical purposes. But so on the pantheism and deism question, pantheism, as I understand it, is just the idea that the universe is God. And I've never understood the what that gets you. It just seems like renaming the universe. Suppose we called the universe God. Would that make you feel better? Well, no, actually, it doesn't make me feel better. It's just a new name for the universe. I've never gotten that. Now, if along with it is an attribution of purpose, if you play that out and say this is why the universe deserves the term God, I guess it could make sense. But bare bones pantheism, I've never understood the appeal of. Now, as it happens, I mean, Spinoza, who kind of is the pantheist, also had a whole kind of mystical worldview that I think there's probably something to be said for and that I might subscribe to. But the relabeling of the universe itself as God, I've never understood. Now, deism is closer to what I'm suggesting may be the case, because deism was originally conceived as compatible with an Enlightenment era view that took science seriously, and the idea was, okay, maybe there aren't, supernatural manipulations in the world, but you could still think of God as something that set the whole process in motion. And, I think a deistic scenario is pretty naturally compatible with what I'm saying, but it's more plausible if you see, interesting and morally significant directionality. Then it's more likely that, there's a deistic kind of God that has attributes of the divine as we traditionally think of it. I mean, maybe a panentheism would be compatible with my worldview. As I understand it, that's the idea that the universe is in God, is in the mind of God, okay? So you still don't get these like hands-on supernatural manipulations. God is in some sense outside the system, but it's not deism, strictly speaking, and I could see that. Oh, yeah. So information, the term gets used in different ways. It does get defined as the opposite of entropy and as the same as order. Or you can define it as a reverse if you want to switch the signs. But in any event, I think that's a different thing from information in the biological sense, in the sense in which humans use information, in the sense that we talk about animals communicating. And I think the difference between those is that's almost a good litmus test for whether something's alive. When you have information in that communicative sense, when you have physical, like molecules and things that represent aspects of the environment for purpose of guiding behavior in a way that is brings it into harmony with the environment and the interest of the organism, I think that's the kind of information that comes into being with biological systems. I wouldn't, as I understand it, the physicist, the information theory sense of information, I think I would tend not to conflate. As for biological information, I think it's good, for one thing, because it seems to be associated with sentience, subjective experience. It gives life meaning. We have pleasure and pain and so on. It's good in that sense, but obviously it can be used for ill. There's all kinds of pernicious communication, and in fact, information technology now is being used about equally for good and ill. This is to some extent the source of the tribalism problem, is yes, information. What's interesting about information is it's fundamental to my worldview in the way it facilitates non-zero sum games and the solution of non-zero sum games. But that can mean people within a very belligerent tribe playing non-zero sum games with each other by communicating on Facebook and so on and coordinating their activities. So I wouldn't, in that sense, I would call it neutral. And it can go either way. And information technology is neutral, and this is, I think, the source of the challenge we face now. Well, the amount of biological information is, sure. The amount of information in the physicist sense, I think, is inexorably declining, as I understand the second law of thermodynamics, and the system of life actually advances that unhappy eventuality. So, does religion, am I saying, I wouldn't say I'm saying that the ends justify the means. I'd say, there's two questions here. I'd say that first, on the question, isn't there controversy over what constitutes good behavior? Yeah, of course there is. And where I've argued about moral truth, I've tried to be very cautious, and it is controversial. On the other hand, there's things I think we'd all agree on. You don't walk up and kill somebody who hasn't done anything, to, in any sense, deserve, who poses no threat, who blah, blah, there's certain things that we'd all agree are bad. My bias is I am more or less a utilitarian in the sense that it seems to me the kind of default, the moral system with the fewest assumptions, the minimalistic moral system, is that everyone's welfare is equally important, you count it equally, and the total amount of welfare is kind of the bottom line, with some exceptions. For philosophers out there, I would be a rule-based utilitarian, not an act-based utilitarian. But that's the assumption I'm bringing to it. But I acknowledge that there are, and that's why I emphasize the solution of non-zero-sum games. It increases the aggregate amount of welfare, and that's what moral imagination can further. I take your point, but at the same time, I think everyone would agree in here about certain good things and certain bad things that are happening in the world right now, and we would like to amplify the good and minimize the bad. I'm not sure I wouldn't say ends justify the means. I would just say maybe the best practical way to judge someone's religious beliefs is to say that if it makes you a better person, assuming we can more or less agree on what a good person is, that's good enough for me. This is partly just a pragmatic statement, that this is no time in the history of the world to be doing what, again, the new atheists, some of them are inclined to do, which is ridiculing people's religious beliefs, which, if you will pay attention, only leads them to retreat further into fundamentalism. It's just we got enough problems without gratuitously antagonizing people. Thank you. And that came from a physicist, so it must be true. The question I didn't totally get, could the global mind be deceiving us? Is what the purpose is? Well, I thought you would ask, is my mind deceiving me? Which is entirely plausible. This is a common accusation, and it's very hard to correct for your biases, because there's probably a human bias that naturally tends to over-attribute purpose. There's my own religious upbringing that's left me probably eager to find some purpose. There's that problem. At the same time, I think there's come to be in kind of intellectual culture, especially in academia, a kind of bias against asserting any kind of larger purpose. It's almost like an embarrassing thing to say, and that's one thing I'm trying to correct for. Anyway, that's not exactly what you're asking. You're asking could the global mind deceive us? I mean, first of all, you're right, the global mind is in a sense the sum of human minds. On the other hand, there are ways to put human minds together in collective enterprise that actually neutralizes individual human bias, and science is the best example of this. There's a myth, I think I mentioned this, but Lawrence Krauss says scientists love to be proven wrong. Lawrence is kind of one of these new atheists, and new atheists kind of tend to glamorize scientific rationalism. It's not true that scientists love to be proven wrong. They're just like the rest of us. The salvation of science is that they have to put their claims in testable form, and so the social system actually extracts truth from all the error. So that you kind of ask about that, I think, the implications of the global mind being a collective of human minds. That could be a good thing that in a sense, purifies thought, I guess. I'm still not sure I get the question about the global mind and purpose. You were nodding your head. Do you understand what he means? Could the global mind fall into the trap of what? Could. What? Not if all the individual humans are meditating? Right. And if they don't start meditating, there may be no enduring global brain, right? So. Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess the global mind would tend to have the interests of the whole thing at heart in a certain sense. And that might lead to biases if it encountered other global minds, especially that are perceived as hostile. But my general feeling about it's a little related, the question of whether should we fear aliens, right? There is this line, I don't know if it was Stephen Hawking or Elon Musk, some of these people were saying, don't be so eager to encounter alien life. My feeling is if they are technologically ahead of us, they will have to be morally advanced relative. They will have to have gotten over this thing where you want to kill whatever you see. And so I'm kind of optimistic about the prospect of not actually encountering them, but the prospect of them treating us decently. Okay, so thank you all the thank you, especially those of you who have been to all 5 lectures. I do see some familiar faces. If I could grant eternal life to anyone, you would be the first. There's food, and I encourage people to stick around for free food. And there's actually even wine, I think. So I'll be around.